Hi everyone, welcome back to Alice and the Giant Bookshelf. Today's video is all about my top favourite books of 2022. Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel, or welcome if you are new. My name's Alice and I have way too many books. And today's video is all about the very best of the best of 2022. So I managed to read an astonishing 177 books in 2022. And for that reason, I'm not going to be making a video summarising every single book like I did last year, because I attempted it last year. I'm not going to be doing that this year, but this year I thought that I would talk about, in this video, my very best books of the year, and the next video will be my least favourite books of the year, and I'll talk a bit about DNFs. So today, only the good stuff, only the cream of the crop. We have, out of 177 books read, I gave 10 books exactly 5 stars. So that's worked out perfectly for my top 10. Before we get to the top 10, I thought I would give a few honourable mentions in genres where there's nothing actually featuring on the top 10 in that genre. So this first part of the video will be my best of the rest, if you like, my top 4-star reads in different categories, and then we'll get swiftly on with the really good 5-star books. So my best classic of the year, and I would have to say both of these are close to being 5-star books for sure. My top favourites were Our Mutual Friend by Charles Dickens, which I listened to on audiobook. I just think that this is a wonderful example of Dickens creating multiple related plot threads, multiple characters, and I absolutely loved the humour in this one. Also an honourable mention to my first ever book by Thomas Hardy. This could probably have been a 5-star as well, but for some reason I didn't give it 5 stars, and that was The Mayor of Casterbridge. I really enjoyed reading this for October. If there was some more room on the list, it might have made it. So my best memoir of the year was The Bucket by Alan Allberg. I absolutely loved this book, and I mentioned it in my top 10 in the middle of the year. This was just such a lovely little memoir of childhood. It was part Alan Allberg's life and part poetry, using some of Alan Allberg's most famous poems and some famous illustrations from illustrators that have illustrated his books over the years. And it all just was a beautiful short book. And if you have a chance to read it, go for it, especially if you loved Janet and Alan Allberg books growing up like I did. I also did want to mention graphic memoirs, because I got into those this year, and my favourite of those would have to be The Roles We Play by Saber Khan. This won the Jalak Prize this year, and I can see why, because it is a wonderful graphic memoir. I felt like I learnt so much from this book, and the illustrations are really stunning. My best sci-fi of the year definitely goes to Project Hail Mary by Andy Weir. I absolutely loved this book. Only thing that probably made this not get a 5-star was it being a little bit too scientific for me, but it definitely had one of my favourite characters of the year, and that was Rocky. I won't say too much more about Rocky, except to say that his way of communicating has just got into my head. Sad. Rocky was just epic. Absolutely loved that book. My favourite short stories of the year would probably go to The Illustrated Man by Ray Bradbury. There was just not a weak story in this collection, in my opinion, and I was stunned by how many different sort of genres and themes Ray Bradbury takes in along the way. My best fantasy, and probably the only fantasy book that I read this year, was The Blade Itself by Joe Abercrombie. I can't wait to read the rest of this series because I really enjoyed this book. I just thought, again, that this had wonderful characters, and it spent most of this book establishing those characters and their roles within the world, and I loved the way that the world building was really done through the eyes of these characters as a kind of side effect of their inner workings. And I would be amiss if I didn't mention another of my favourite characters of the year, Glokta. He is just a spectacular villain. And this was probably one of my favourite audiobooks of the year as well, because the voicing on this was just so perfect, especially for Glocta, who, when his inner monologue was in action, had a different voice to when he spoke out loud because he doesn't have very many teeth. So I just thought that was such a good touch by the narrator. Fantastic audiobook, and maybe the start of a new relationship with fantasy for me. Who knows? My favourite new to me author this year, so an author who I hadn't read any books by before, and I read more than one book of theirs this year, would be Kazuo Ishiguro. I read 3 books by him: The Buried Giant, Never Let Me Go, and the first one I read was Clara and the Sun. And I think Ishiguro has definite potential to be a favourite author. I'm looking forward to reading The Remains of the Day, and I would love your recommendations if you are also an Ishiguro fan. Where else should I go after The Remains of the Day? My favourite series that I read from start to finish in 2022 was the Anne of Green Gables series. I didn't love every single book in this series. I felt that some in the middle wandered away from Anne's story. However, the start of the series, Anne of Green Gables, still remains a favourite book. And the end of the series, Rillet of Ingleside, was just wonderful. And it was what made it worth reading all of the books in between, because it was just fabulous. I really did enjoy Anne of Avonlea as well. This was my favourite series I read all the way through this year. Thank you to Emily at Novell Novels for hosting a read-along of these. My favourite series I started but didn't finish this year would have to be the Wolf Hall trilogy by Hilary Mantel. My favourite book in it was Bring Up the Bodies. I have not yet read The Mirror and the Light, hence this is my favourite unfinished trilogy that I've read this year. So my best thriller of the year, and believe it or not, there are no out-and-out thrillers on the top 10. My favourite thriller would be between these two. The Unheard by Nikki French, which I absolutely loved. This is kind of more of a psychological domestic thriller. I love the way Nikki French write details of everyday life into their books, and I thought that this was a brilliant book. I also thought that this was a brilliant book. I buddy read this one with Berna from Berna's Bookish Adventures, and that's Pieces of Her by Karen Slaughter. I thought the book was brilliantly put together, and I always enjoy a Karen Slaughter book, so honourable mention to that one as well. And finally, my favourite rereads of the year, because I haven't included any rereads in the top 10, would have to be rereading Agatha Christie, of course. And my favourite 2 rereads of Agatha Christie this year were Sleeping Murder, which is Miss Marple's final case. I loved this even more on the second time of reading, if that's possible. Always been my favourite Marple. And then there were none I probably would say I didn't enjoy as much on the second reading, but it is still by far and away one of Agatha Christie's greatest accomplishments. So yeah, wonderful standalone book. Let's get into the top 10. If you've been watching my channel this year, I think you will know most of these books. Let me know in the comments down below what's going to be my top 2 or 3. I think you'll be able to guess it. In at number 10 we have Heartstopper by Alice Oseman. I've cheated a bit here because I can pick a whole 4-book series here really, but the one I've decided to hold up is volume 2 because this was my absolute favourite of the 4. I couldn't put Nick and Charlie's story down. I think I enjoyed book 1 and 2 more than 3 and 4 because I really loved that sort of tentative friendship between them in book 1 and in book 2 where it starts to develop, and really book 2 is kind of Nick's story. This is sort of where they're really embarking on a relationship. All of the books are so wholesome and lovely, but I really did enjoy volume 2 the most, and that was the one I gave 5 stars to. In at number 9, another illustrated book. This is Julia and the Shark by Kieran Millwood Hargrave, illustrated by Tom DeFreston. I just thought this was an absolutely wonderful story. Again, really heartwarming. I really enjoyed the way that big issues are dealt with in this sort of middle grade age book. I just thought Julia's story was so interesting. Her mother, who is kind of on the trail of this shark, was really interesting. Her father, who's repairing a lighthouse, really interesting. The whole thing, just a wonderful story. And the illustrations added so much to this. It's absolutely stunning. In at number 8, an audiobook that I have not yet bought myself a physical copy of. was Sorrow and Bliss by Meg Mason. I read this for the Women's Prize shortlist, and I thought that this was a real contender to win this prize. It was absolutely wonderful. I enjoyed every minute with the characters in this book, even though sometimes they infuriated me. Sorrow and Bliss so perfectly combined its elements for me. So on the one hand, it's a book that is strongly about Martha's mental health and her diagnosis, which is never actually revealed as a specific medical condition in the book, which I thought was very clever. But the book also balances that with humour, and I thought this book was hilariously well done. I loved Martha's family and the way everyone interacted, and there were just such funny scenes in this book, and I really thought that the humour was a really good way to deal with the bigger issues. In at number 7, we have the only non-fiction on the list, which is a big change from last year, because last year the top 2 were non-fiction. Poirot, the Greatest Detective in the World by Mark Aldridge. I absolutely love this non-fiction. It kind of is the type of non-fiction that I like, a book about books, but it kind of isn't, because most of the books about books that I really enjoy are sort of memoirish books. This is more of a record of all the different Poirot books and Poirot in other media. I just thought it was wonderful. There is an individual review of this on my channel if you would like to find out more. But yeah, this was a strong 5 stars for me. Coming in at number 6, another book I read because it was on the Women's Prize long list this time, and it was definitely robbed of a place on the shortlist. And I listened to this on audiobook, however I have since bought myself a copy, and that is Careless by Kirsty Capes. If you would have told me at the beginning of the year that one of my top books was going to be a book about teenage pregnancy, and a book that would probably be best described as a contemporary, I just would not have believed you. I wouldn't have. But this book was just wonderful. The theme I'm noticing in all of these books is that they were about really strong characters that I loved. The thing that usually made the difference between a 5-star book for me and a 4-star book for me was if I strongly connected with the characters and thought they were amazingly written. This book is a first-person perspective again, from the point of view of Bess, who is 15 years old and pregnant. She discovers this on page 1. It's also about Bess's relationships, and the best relationship of all in this book is her relationship with her best friend Ishao. Ishao goes above and beyond as a friend, she really does, and I thought the relationship between the two of them and the discussion of both of their issues as teenagers and family issues. And I also have an individual review of Careless on my channel, so if you'd like to know more about it. And it is an amazing book, and it's also an absolutely amazing audiobook. Highly recommend that. In at number 5, the only book on this list that I don't own either a physical or an audio copy of, and that is Maps of Our Spectacular Bodies by Maddie Mortimer. This is the only book I really enjoyed reading from the Booker Prize long list this year. Again, I thought that this was a book like Careless that missed out on the shortlist when it shouldn't have, and this was an extremely sad book, a book about a terminally ill woman and her relationship both with her mother and her daughter. For me, this one got 5 stars because I loved the language in this book and the way it was put together in such a different way, and the way words moved about the page, the way parts of this book were very much told by different parts of the body, by the cancer in Leah's body. It was a tough read, but a really incredible read. I've spoken about this one in a lot more detail in a video about the Booker Prize, so I'll leave that linked down below as well. Right, we're well and truly into the top 5. These last 4 are my absolutely spectacular reads of the year. I honestly, any one of these could have been my number 1. I enjoyed them so much, but there's just one that I've had such a soft spot for all year. I think most of you watching my channel will be able to name these top 4. We're going to start with Great Circle by Maggie Shipstead in at number 4. Again, if you'd have told me at the beginning of 2022, you will read a book that is historical fiction, that is about a female aviator, and that is over 600 pages, and it will be one of your absolute top reads of the year, and you will probably think about it being one of your favourite books of all time, I would not have believed you. But that is exactly what happened. So this is the wonderful, wonderful, epic, sweeping tale of Marianne Graves and her desire to pilot a plane around the great circle of the world. This is the historical timeline. There's also a present day timeline, which is Hadley Baxter's story. Hadley Baxter is an actress, and she is going to be playing Marianne in a biopic. Now, every single detail in Great Circle comes into its own. Sometimes you'll be reading a section and think, I don't know why this is here, but none of it is wasted in the end. And for me, that made this a almost perfect book. I just thought this was absolutely incredible. Again, this is one I listened to on audiobook. Again, it was a buddy read, this time with Gemma from Gemma Books, who I actually read Careless with as well, along with Dani. I just think Maggie Shipstead absolutely wrote a book that should have won all the prizes, all of them, every single one. It was just so good. To make someone like me, who has no staying power for books over 500 pages, who didn't previously love sort of historical sweeping epics, to make me name this as one of my favourite books of the year and of all time is pretty spectacular. It is a spectacular book. I don't know what else to say about Great Circle. Words are failing me. It's a wonderful book. It took a lot to knock Great Circle off the number 3 spot. To be honest, I would say that these two are probably interchangeable as to where they are on the list. But at number 3, I've put Hamnet by Maggie O'Farrell. This book was absolutely heartbreaking in the extreme, but it was also wonderful. I have never read a book until this one that felt like, I'm lost for words, that felt like an immersive experience. It felt like Maggie O'Farrell sort of took me and planted me in Shakespearean times. So vivid was the picture she was giving me of this place and this time and this life. So Hamnet, I think everybody has read and praised Hamnet. Probably don't need to give it much introduction. Shakespeare sort of appears in this peripherally as the writer or the father, and it's predominantly a book about Shakespeare's wife and his children and his son Hamnet, who died. This book, I was surprised to find, was actually very much about Agnes, Shakespeare's wife, and it was about her life before the children, it was about her life with the children, it was about grief. I don't think I've ever read a book that so accurately, for me, portrayed grief in the latter half of this book. It's a wonderful, wonderful book. If you haven't read it yet, it's wonderful. So, into my top 2, we have Fight Night by Miriam Taves, and this book was kindly sent to me by Tandem for a read-along over on Instagram. It was actually a listen-along. I was also sent the audiobook, and the audiobook was absolutely incredible too. Perfect, perfect voices for the voice of this book. So Fight Night by Miriam Taves is a very different book again. And again, it's the characters that made this book for me. So the characters are Swiv and her grandmother, and those are the main two, but they also live with Swiv's mum. Just the relationship between Swiv and Grandma is almost enough on its own, but they were hilarious together. Grandma is the most hilarious character I've probably ever read. It made me laugh, it made me cry. It was a beautifully told story, told by a 9-year-old Swiv, and I just am in awe of Miriam Taves' ability to tell this story. It's short, but it's wonderful. I could already reread this. It was so great. So highly, highly recommend that one too. And finally, we have my number one book of the year. It has been unchanged since March, so you all know what it is, and it is Cloud Cuckoo Land by Anthony Dewar. I read this for the BookTube Prize, and I feel like another theme of this list is how surprised I was to love the books. So this one shouldn't have been as much of a surprise, but a lot of these were favourites because they were so surprising in the way that I loved them. But Cloud Cuckoo Land is something else altogether, and I feel like I continuously talk about my love for this book, and that I feel like this is going to end up being one of those books that is underrated. I don't see people reading it and appreciating it and talking about it, but they should be. Cloud Cuckoo Land, as I've said many times here, has 3 different timelines. One is set in the future, one is set way in the past at the Siege of Constantinople, and one is in sort of modern times, but we do get the historical backstories of the 2 characters that the 2020 storyline is about. What made this book for me was the pure love of books and libraries that came through in this book. So although this book is about all of those 5 characters, what binds them together across these massively disparate timelines is an ancient text, Cloud Cuckoo Land, which is like a lost ancient text that each of these timelines interacts with in its own way. And libraries are so central to this, and it's really very much talking about how books can survive, how they can relentlessly survive, even being lost, and I just love this. Any book that is about books and libraries is going to appeal to me. This one also threw in quite a lot of strangeness, and I love a strange book, and I just couldn't stop reading this. It just went from strength to strength for me, and I was stunned, I was sobbing. It was such an interesting and wonderful book for me. This is definitely a book that I think that not everybody will appreciate the way that I've appreciated it, but absolutely number one for me of my reads this year. Definitely a favourite book of all time. That was my top 10. You can see from this list that I really discovered literary fiction this year, and that was very much thanks to the BookTube Prize, which opened my eyes to getting out of my comfort zone, reading books that I don't think I previously really registered that they were, as well as literary fiction, sort of historical fiction, and I so enjoyed those books this year. I am quite stingy with my star ratings, but these were the 10 books I really, really connected with in 2022. Do let me know in the comments, what were your favourite books of 2022? Have you read any of these? Would you like to read any of these? I would absolutely love to hear from you. If you have enjoyed this top 10 with honourable mentions, please do give it a like. Please do consider subscribing if you haven't already. And I will hope very much to see you all again soon for another video all about books here on Alice and the Giant Bookshelf. Bye for now.